Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second to last class. You read the last chapter, the last body chapter in A Future History of Water. I realize now that I forgot to assign the conclusion, so if you want to treat that as an optional reading for next Wednesday, go ahead and you can do that. Otherwise, we'll just ignore it. So this chapter is about the device of the Pact. And the chapter is specifically focusing on the Water Pact in Brazil. The Water Pact is this device, a political mechanism of what's called participatory policy. And the idea is that it's essentially a promise, where the idea is to get lots and lots of people to promise to care for water, and to care for water in different ways. So this can include farmers, politicians, people in all kinds of different positions, right? And based on those positions and their different geographical contexts, they're going to promise different things, right? A teacher promises to teach people about, to educate people about water issues, for example. And so this is the core thing of the Water Pact, right? It's a collection of promises. It's not a policy. It's not it's not a technical device. It is a promise that's about changing how people understand their commitments to water on a moral level. This is a challenge to older political systems, such as the drought industry and coronelismo. As I was saying, the aim is not to transform law. The aim is to create the preconditions for transformations in law as well as transformations in society through a broader moral shift, through this kind of pact, this collection of promises. And because it's a collection of promises and not a policy, there's nothing universal about it. There's no central authority that regulates it. Instead, it's really just commitments made by different people in different locations and contexts. However, because of that, right, there's pros to that, right? There are things that are positive in terms of the ways in which the proponents of the Water Pact see this as a challenge to politics as usual. See this as a challenge to the limitations of law and policy-centered orientations to water as a human right. But the problem that it faces is that it's impossible to assess or evaluate in terms of how effective it is. Did the promises work? Are people actually living up to their promises? How is this creating material impacts? And you can't measure those things. So the pact is this thing, right, that kind of, it's hard to measure. It's a thing that creates change that you can never assess or measure. Which is interesting, right? As an anthropologist, I find that interesting. And Ballesteros writes that the proponents of the Water Pact wanted to change Ceará future history by drawing on people's sense of everyday ethical action. So this isn't about it's not about a legal transformation, it's not about a single policy. It's about a transformation in everyday ethical action. To do so, they would not make the mistake of beginning with water infrastructure itself, determining the ways to move and allocate water, nor would they turn to the law and its universal obligations. Instead, they would focus on people's inherent capacity to care, making every member of society recognize their moral obligation to cuidar de agua, or care for water, according to their own capacities and in harmony with their everyday contextual demands. So that quote is the heart of what the pact is about, right? It's about creating a future history not through legal action, but rather through this work of everyday social obligations in a way that's patchy instead of universal, to use Anna Singh's word, in a way that acknowledges that people's the ways people care for water and their moral obligations are going to be different. They're going to understand them differently in different locations, and they're going to have different obligations. In treating those differences as a positive thing, or at least a generative thing, I should say. Positive is a little too flat, but generative. And then in this last quote, this is where Ballestero really says what they're trying to do with this chapter. So instead of documenting their failures, I'm interested in how they imagine the pact can transform the world of water. So what this chapter is about is how this device of the pact, how the proponents of the pact imagine that this is going to transform water issues. So part of how this works, right, is through an approach that the proponents, or that Ballestero at least describes as a methodology rather than solutions. It's about a process, not about the end results. Ballestero calls this participatory policy process, meaning that it's not policy directed from on high, from the top down, but rather it's a way of doing policy that involves grassroots participation and bottom-up participation. She also calls it unruly municipalities, which is a term I really like a lot. So in terms of this focus on process or methodology, Ballestero describes this as an emphasis on how instead of what. The proponents hoped to show participants how to arrive to their own ideas about what needed to be done in their localities by redirecting the focus from what collective actions were appropriate to take, and instead focusing on how to invite people to act. The PACT team asked bureaucrats and the public to engage in the slippery everydayness of their relationships with water. And so, right, this is about process. It's about how instead of about what. It's about inviting people into act rather than creating a solution and applying it. Instead of imagining social justice as creating a more just policy that can be delivered and enacted and operationalized, this is about how do you invite people into act. I love that phrase, how to invite people to act. And Ballestero writes, the PACT organizers believed that this methodological choice would prevent the PACT from becoming a list of technical solutions, acclimated as they were, accumulated as if they were the possessions of a few social actors with the requisite amount of capital and technical knowledge to implement them. They wanted the pact to be about different flows of action, dynamic arrangements of bodies, affects, and materials, minor rearrangements that when aggregated could yield major transformations. Regardless of your position, you could be part of the pact. Thus, the promises people made took a seemingly unremarkable form, ordinary, everyday work commitments. And as you can see in these pictures, right, this is a kind of participatory policy process in that you have people discussing and workshopping these ideas and frameworks and their pacts in these kinds of groups. And these are both images taken from these workshops where people are working through the pact in their own local context. And this is what the pact is about, right? It's not a technical fix. It's about changing flows of action. It's about little transformations, little things that add up to major transformations. But the thing is, when you have this kind of loose, diffuse, and decentralized political process, there's a lot of contradictions. People disagree with each other. People have different perspectives on what should be done. Their positions may be contradictory. And there's this lovely passage, right, where one of the people pushing forward the pact process, this guy Ernesto, is talking to some people in a meeting, and he says, and Ballestero writes that he raises the publication into the air, and using his arm as a pivot to make sure everyone could see the green cover, Ernesto proudly described the report as a document full of contradictions, designed not merely to produce a picture, but interpret a picture. Ernesto believed that contradiction was good, something to be promoted, an index of the pact's future success. If the pact housed deep contradictions, then they had been effective in capturing the diverging conditions under which people live their lives and deal with water. I love this, right? For Ernesto, the pact has to be contradictory for it to be successful. Had it not been contradictory, it would not be successful because it could not have captured the reality of people's diverse lives. I think this is especially interesting to think about in relationship to the previous chapter on libertarianism, right? The role that contradiction played within these libertarian ideologies in Costa Rica. Here, we see contradiction playing into leftist ideologies in a very different way in Brazil. And Ballesteros continues, as with any program or policy, with these interventions, some people inevitably benefited, and some people were left worse off. This is talking about the history of water interventions, right? Historically, water interventions benefited some people and left other people worse off. And that history made Ernesto unafraid of contradiction. On the contrary, he knew that the only thing left to do was to let contradictions proliferate without trying to fully align people's interests, social relations, and conflicts. This is very similar to what Singh talks about, right, in terms of a commons without harmony. This is not about bringing people into harmony. It's not about eliminating contradiction or tension. It's about creating the conditions in which those contradictions can flourish as a project of empowering people to address the contradictions and inequalities in their own lives. It's about creating conditions that enable people, that empower people in ways that they aren't empowered already, right? It's not that contradictions are bad. What's bad is the way in which contradictions are enforced and reproduced, right? You could look at the contradiction in capitalism between workers and CEOs, or workers and capitalists. That contradiction, that tension in their interests and needs and desires is not inherently a bad thing. However, the way in which power operates in most nation states is to apply force, including military and police force, in order to not resolve that contradiction, but suppress it. And this is about letting those contradictions flourish, about empowering people to transform their own lives based on their own positions and locations and contexts. It's about creating conditions for struggle to flourish. And as a way of illustrating these conflicts, Ballesteros talks about the story of this man, Antonio, and this moment in which he refuses to shake this other person's hand. This what's the word I'm looking for? Like a consultant's hand. And so the consultant was giving this presentation, was talking, and reached out the hand to show to Antonio. Right, in this gesture where you make an agreement and you shake hands to solidify that agreement, that social gesture like that. And Antonio stepped back and didn't shake hands, and eventually the consultant realized and pulled back, and it was kind of nervous and anxious. And the thing here, what Antonio is doing, is creating this kind of dynamic where Antonio is not agreeing. They are not entering into that agreement. They are holding space in which they're very critical of the pact. And that's actually what the organizers want. And so Ballesteros writes that Antonio was describing a form of involvement that made explicit the doubts and reservations one harbored instead of suppressing them. Putting one's doubts front and center gave the right impression that one is a political actor with ideas of one's own, not a docile body that could be easily co-opted into a collective controlled by somebody else. This is why I will work with the pacts, because it's not completely theirs, Antonio told me. So Antonio's open to the pact, but he's also critical of it. And he knows that he doesn't own it. And he knows that he can't always agree to everything. He is operating from a space of critique and doubt and keeping those contradictions out in the open so that they can flourish. Not a docile body that could be easily co-opted into a collective controlled by somebody else, but as a political actor with ideas of one's own. And the refusal to shake this other person's hand is this dramatic enactment of that logic of refusal to be fully incorporated. that refusal that is actually the very heart of this logic of unruly municipalities, of this version of participatory politics that foregrounds contradictions. Right, so the idea is that life is inherently contradictory. Social relations are contradictory in real ways, right? We can talk about structural violence, for example, and the contradictions of systems of power and oppression. Life is contradictory, and politics and political orientations, the pact has to be able to encompass that for it to work. And Ballesteros continues that Ernesto wanted the rest of the team of consultants to think of the pact the way Antonio did. If technocrats and bureaucrats came up with a particular solution to water issues, people like Antonio were likely to point out how their solution allocated costs and benefits among members of their networks and would be the most likely to reject the proposal. On the contrary, if there were spaces for people like Antonio to bring his own suggestions from the specificity of his political obligations in his town, his municipality, and the demands of his constituencies, something different could be possible. So this is what the pact is about, right? It's not about technocrats and bureaucrats coming up with a solution and imposing it across the board. It's not about universal obligations. And Ernesto is noting, right, that if that was the approach, if it was a top-down approach, they would have significant opposition from people like Antonio, who would see, oh, this is another system that benefits other people but not my constituencies. This is another system that will not work for us. And instead, this is a process that lets people like Antonio participate in defining those policies, that lets people participate from their own geographical and social locations in order to avoid the problems of these top-down approaches, in order to avoid, right, just in order to engage with the reality that different cities and towns and constituencies are going to have different needs. So again, right, this is a response to the reality that political processes are going to inherently benefit some people and disadvantage others. So given that, how do you create a space in which people are empowered to engage with those contradictions and struggle? How do you empower people in struggle? And this brings me to Ballesteros' point about aggregation. The pact is fundamentally an aggregation of promises. It's this kind of funny thing, right, where the way it works is by having people write down promises so all those promises can be aggregated on pieces of paper, like index cards. And so she writes that, this is the second quote, what makes the pact interesting is that its form has the capacity to make a promise aggregatable. That is, and at the same time, it allows it to remain faithful to its particular scale and context. We can think about this in relationship to Singh's critique of scalability and non-scalability. The pact lets you count all of the promises. It lets you aggregate them. Yet at the same time, each promise remains accountable to its specific relations. Each promise is non-scalable in that the promises don't add up to a whole. They add up to a working set of contradictions. And Ballesteros also writes that the pact centers on a smaller unit, the promise, a commitment that does not require a subject to belong, a member to be incorporated. This smaller unit, the promise, is not about incorporating individual people into, for example, a nation or into law. It's again a set of working contradictions. It's an aggregate of promises, each of which are accountable to their own patchy local scales. It is both scalable in the sense that you can aggregate the promises in certain ways, you can count them. It is non-scalable in that the promises remain embedded in their context and cannot be picked up and moved to another context without transforming the promise. You can't take one person's promise and apply it to another one without problems. So to explain this idea of aggregation, Ballesteros draws on two different models of what aggregation means, right? And this is a really interesting term for me, right? Because as an anthropologist, I often teach students that there are limits to aggregation, that aggregation is limiting, right? We often, in the United States, imagine society as an aggregate of individuals, as a collection of individual people. So, for example, a lot of political mobilization is oriented around changing hearts and minds. The idea being like, if we can just get enough people to think like we do, that's how we cause social change. Now, the problem as an anthropologist or as a sociologist is that society is not simply an aggregate of individuals. Society includes things like social structures and institutions that are not really the same as individual people, right? You can't understand something like white supremacy or a university as a collection of individuals, as an aggregate. It's more than that. It's something else. And so this idea that I critique in my intro classes is an idea that comes from Thomas Hobbes' concept of the Leviathan, or his book called Leviathan. And this is I want to say it was written in the 1500s. It's just prior to what's called the Enlightenment, but it's this philosophical treaty that really forms the basis of a lot of ideas about capitalism and nation states or state governance that later scholars later philosophers adapted into what we would call the tenets of liberalism in terms of capitalism and democracy. And so Thomas Hobbes' idea, right, was that society is an aggregate of individuals. And Hobbes has this drawing within his work, right, which is a representation of his idea of government, right? Society is an aggregate of individual people, and then the sovereign, the king, is the ruler who represents all that aggregation of individuals. The authority that governs and rules that aggregate collection. And so this is the idea of the Leviathan, the state as this aggregation of individuals, as a representation of all of those individuals. And Ballestero critiques this model, right? She says, in this illustration, we can see how, at the end of the day, the collective is an all-encompassing whole where the individual is assumed to be a smaller part of a larger unified entity represented by the ruler. Leviathan is composed of the sum of clear units, the whole bodies of its subjects, the subjects of the state, the subjects of the sovereign. Those subjects are clearly incorporated, distinctively conceptualized as belonging to the body of the ruler. And if you think about the concept of the king in Europe, the king was the embodiment of law, the embodiment of the state. The king was the embodiment of the people. The king was a representative, not in the way of like a democratic representative, but rather the king was the representation of the people, of the subjects, of the state. Of course, kings were very ritualized roles. About that. It really was about embodying this aggregation, this aggregate of subjects, which were to be ruled. Which is why the king's word is law, because their body is the people. It's not. They wouldn't say the people. That's not the right word. But their body is the aggregation of subjects upon which they ruled. But Ballestero, as an alternative, puts forward an alternative concept of aggregation. This is something that actually resonates quite a bit with Singh again. And she writes, she's drawing on this artist Lamas. Unlike Leviathan's illustration, Lamas's image does not offer us an easy depiction of constitutive units. Are these trees, leaves, bacteria? In his image, it is difficult to elucidate any uniform units. We cannot automatically see the summation of clear, self-evident subjects. We need to ask ourselves by what method the elements were selected and gathered. So you can see the image right on the right of this idea of the aggregate as represented by this artist, Lamas. And what Ballestero really likes about this, is that she's trying to get us to ask, what if we thought about aggregate not as Leviathan, but as a bacteria, or as an aggregation of leaves or trees, or branches? What if we thought of the aggregate as mycelium, to go back to Singh? And so there's no discrete ideas or subjects here, right? There's not discrete subjects to be ruled. It's much more complex than that. And so we need to ask ourselves, I love this quote at the end, we need to ask ourselves by what method the elements were selected and gathered. It matters what the methods are through which we assemble these aggregations. And we can't take those methods as taken for granted. One of the reasons why I love that line is because so many times in the nonprofit world, in my brief foray into the nonprofit world, there were so many moments in which people threw money at agencies would throw money, foundations would throw money at things that they considered to be social problems. And they figured they were social problems because they had scientific reports that were published and described the problem. Now, the problem is the methodology of those reports was shit and often reproduced racist assumptions that you could trace back to the 1960s. Or further. I'm thinking of a particular dynamic in Miami that has to do with anti-Cuban racism. But, right, the dynamic, right, is that people don't read the methodology section. They see the results of the study. And so instead, Ballestero is saying we actually really need to pay attention to the methods. What are the methods by which this aggregation was formed and not a different aggregation? We could think about that with Dave too, right? What are the approaches? What's the method, and how does the method create certain potentialities, certain social possibilities, certain preconditions for particular futures while foreclosing others? So here's some discussion questions to talk about on the forum. If you have something you are aching to talk about or itching to talk about that's not on this list, go for it. I'm happy to do that. Since we're at the end of the book, part of these questions involve this chapter, while other questions are about thinking about the book as a whole.